A German shepherd stranded on a rock in the middle of a raging river. The current is violent, the water is rising, and the dog is moments away from being swept away. No one dares to go in until a young man does something absolutely unthinkable. What happens next will leave you speechless. The river was louder than usual. The heavy rains from the past week had turned it into a violent, foaming surge of water, carrying broken branches and debris. Downstream, it was the kind of current that swallowed anything that fell into it. Merciless, cold, and unstoppable. Ethan Carter, a 22-year-old college student, had grown up near these woods. He knew every trail, every hidden shortcut. But today, something felt different. He had gone for his usual morning run along the riverbank, earbuds in, letting his music drown out the world. But as he reached the clearing that overlooked the water, he suddenly stopped. A noise, a sound that didn't belong at first. He thought it was just the wind whistling through the trees, or maybe a distant bird call. But then it came again, a bark, faint, desperate. Ethan ripped out his earbuds, heart pounding. He turned towards the river, scanning the churning water, the fallen logs, the jagged rocks. Then he saw it out in the middle of the raging current, perched on a slippery, moss-covered rock, was a German shepherd. The dog was crouched low, ears flat-tailed, tucked between its legs. Terrified, its wet fur clung to its body, and Ethan could see it, shivering. The rock it clung to was barely above water, with the current crashing against it. From both sides, it wouldn't hold for long. Ethan's stomach dropped. How did it get there? Had it been swept in by the current and somehow managed to climb onto the rock? Had someone abandoned it? There was no sign of anyone else nearby, no footprints on the muddy bank, no calls for a missing dog. He pulled out his phone, no signal. Of course, this deep in the forest, there was never any reception. Running back to town for help would take too long. The dog barked again, locking eyes with him, and in that moment Ethan understood. It wasn't just scared, it was pleading. Every instinct screamed at him to think before acting. The river was deadly. If he miscalculated, if he slipped, he could be the one who needed saving. He scanned the area, searching for something. Anything that could help. His eyes landed on a fallen tree trunk stretching part way over the water. If he could use it to inch his way closer, maybe he could find a way to get the dog to safety. But just as he was about to move, a deep, menacing crack echoed through the air. Ethan's heart froze. The rock beneath the dog shifted for a split second. He saw pure terror in the shepherd's eyes as its paws scrambled for grip, and then the unthinkable happened. The rock tilted the mossy surface, giving way beneath the dog's weight. The shepherd yelped as its body slid the moment its paws left the rock. Ethan's instincts took over. He ran the moment Ethan saw the German shepherd lose its grip. His body moved before his mind could catch up. His feet pounded against the wet dirt as he sprinted toward the edge of the riverbank. The world around him blurred. All he saw was the dog, slipping, falling peering into the current. No, no, no. With a final desperate push, the shepherd kicked against the rock, trying to leap toward safety, but it wasn't enough. The current caught its hind legs, pulling it downward. Its head dipped beneath the water. Ethan lunged forward just as the dog's head reappeared. "Hold on," he shouted, even though he knew the dog couldn't understand him. His voice barely carried over the deafening rush of the river. The shepherd paddled frantically, trying to fight against the current, but the force of the water was too much. It was being dragged away. Ethan's eyes darted to the fallen tree trunk he had spotted earlier. It stretched over the water, slick with rain. But it was his only chance. With his heart hammering in his chest, he ran toward it and jumped onto the trunk, gripping the rough bark. As he steadied himself, his sneakers nearly slipped, but he crouched low, using his hands to keep balance. The dog was getting farther away. Seconds counted. Ethan crawled out onto the log, feeling it shift slightly beneath his weight. If it snapped, he was dead. If he hesitated, the dog was dead. He took a deep breath. Then he did something reckless. He jumped. The river was like hitting a wall the second he hit the water. The current yanked at him like a set of invisible hands, dragging him downward, freezing, brutal, unforgiving. He barely had time to kick to the surface before a wave slapped him across the face, forcing him to swallow a mouthful of ice-cold water. He coughed, gasping for air, blinking frantically as he searched for the shepherd. There, just a few feet away, the dog was struggling, its head bobbing up and down, paddling with every ounce of strength it had left. Ethan swam harder than he ever had in his life. His arms burned, his legs felt like dead weight, but he pushed through. Every second mattered with a final surge forward. His fingers grazed wet fur. The shepherd yelped, twisting in fear, almost pulling away, but Ethan grabbed the scruff of its neck, holding tight. "I've got you," he gasped, trying to keep both their heads above water. The dog was panicking, its legs kicking wildly. It wasn't fighting him, but it was too scared to stay still. They needed a way out. Ethan turned his head, scanning the riverbanks. The current was carrying them fast. If he didn't act now, they'd be swept farther. Downstream, where jagged rocks waited, a fallen branch jutted out from the water ahead. It was half submerged, its twisted roots sticking up like fingers reaching for the sky. It was their only chance. Ethan adjusted his grip on the shepherd, then kicked with every ounce of strength he had left. The current fought back, pulling them sideways, but he forced them forward, his arms aching, his lungs burning. 10 feet, 5 feet, almost there. He reached out and caught hold of the branch. For a terrifying second, he thought his grip would slip. His fingers were frozen, his muscles weak, but then he held firm. The shepherd clawed at him, trying to climb higher. Ethan used every bit of strength to hoist the dog up, pushing it onto the branch first. "Come on, buddy," he grunted. Climbed the dog, scrambled up paws, slipping claws, digging into the wet wood. Then it made it. The shepherd collapsed onto the branch chest, heaving water, dripping from its fur. Ethan, however, wasn't safe yet. His arms trembled, his grip failing. The river wanted him. His fingers started to slip, and then he fell. The moment Ethan's fingers slipped from the branch, he knew he was in trouble. The river swallowed him whole, the current yanking him beneath the surface like a puppet on strings. The cold hit his chest like a hammer, forcing the air from his lungs. His arms flailed, desperate to find something, anything to hold on to, but there was nothing but water. Dark, crushing water for a split second. The world around him, blurred up and down, no longer existed. He could hear nothing but the rush of the current, feel nothing but the sheer force of the river pulling him deeper. Then adrenaline kicked in. Move, Ethan. Move his body. Obeyed before his brain could process. He twisted, kicking hard, fighting against the current, forcing himself toward the surface. His lungs burned, his head pounded the second his face broke through the water. He gasped for air, sucking in precious oxygen, but he wasn't safe, not even close. The current was dragging him further, downstream toward the jagged rocks he had noticed earlier. If he hit them at this speed, he was done. Panic surged through him, but then something caught his eye. The German shepherd. It was still on the fallen branch, standing now, ears perked, watching him. Its soaked fur clung to its frame, but it wasn't running away, it was waiting. Ethan's chest clenched. This dog, a complete stranger to him, hadn't abandoned him. That thought alone gave him a final burst of energy. Using the last of his strength, he fought against the current, angling himself toward the left bank of the river. His legs felt like lead, his arms burned, but he focused on one thing: survival. He spotted a cluster of low-hanging tree roots jutting out from the riverbank. His last chance. With a desperate reach, he extended his arm, fingers stretching almost there. The water slammed him sideways. His head hit something hard, a submerged log or a rock. sending a sharp pain through his skull. Stars exploded behind his eyes, his vision blurred, his grip faltered. No, don't black out, not now then. Teeth something grabbed his shirt. The shepherd. Ethan barely had time to register it before the dog's powerful jaws pulled, yanking his body toward the roots, using the last ounce of his strength. He latched on his fingers, dug into the wet wood as he hauled himself up, coughing up river water. Every muscle in his body screamed in exhaustion, but he didn't let go. He refused. Finally, he pulled himself onto solid ground for several moments. He lay there panting, staring at the sky, feeling the ground beneath him, trying to convince himself he was alive. And then a wet nose nudged his cheek. The German shepherd, the dog, hadn't left him. Ethan turned his head. Meeting those deep brown eyes, the shepherd panted. Dripping wet ears perked forward. "You saved me," Ethan rasped, barely able to believe it. The dog wagged its tail as if to say, "You saved me first." A weak laugh escaped Ethan's lips as he reached up, running his fingers through the shepherd's wet fur. They had both survived, but one question still remained. Who did this dog belong to? Ethan lay on the damp ground, his breath still coming. In ragged gasps, his limbs felt like they had turned to stone. Heavy, bruised, and useless, every part of his body ached from the cold bite of the river to the sharp pain radiating from his head where he had struck something underwater. But he was alive, and so was the German shepherd. The dog sat beside him, shaking out its drenched coat, spraying water in all directions. Its deep brown eyes never left Ethan's face, as if still assessing him, making sure he was okay. "You—" Ethan paused to catch his breath, his throat raw from swallowing river water. He coughed, his chest tightening, then swallowed hard before trying again. "You really pulled me out, huh?" The shepherd gave a small wag of its tail, but remained still. Its ears perked forward. Ethan slowly pushed himself up onto his elbows. His muscles protested, but he forced himself to sit. The sun had begun peeking through the treetops, casting golden light over the riverbank. He turned, looking back at the raging water that had nearly killed him. It was still fast, still powerful, but now it was behind him. His attention shifted to the dog. It sat obediently, tail curled around its paws, watching him like a guardian. "Where's your owner?" Ethan asked. Scanning the trees, the surrounding woods were eerily quiet, apart from the distant sound of rushing water. There were no voices, no frantic shouts for lost dog. Nothing. A knot formed in Ethan's chest. "You're alone, aren't you?" The shepherd's ears twitched, but it didn't move. Ethan exhaled, running a hand through his dripping hair. He had no idea how long the dog had been stranded on that rock, but one thing was clear. It had been fighting for its life, just like him. Ethan tried to stand. His legs wobbled, his body protesting every movement, but he managed to get up. The second he did, the shepherd rose with him, standing close to his side. He tested a step forward. The dog followed another step. The shepherd stayed right beside him. Ethan let out a small breath. "Guess you're coming with me, huh?" The dog gave its tail another slow wag, for the first time since his terrifying fall into the river. Ethan felt something other than exhaustion. He felt companionship. The hike back to town was rough. Ethan's body ached with every step, and his soaked clothes clung to him, making the morning air feel even colder. The shepherd kept pace beside him, ears alert, occasionally glancing up at him as if checking his condition. "Not going to lie," Ethan muttered as they walked. "I didn't think I'd be making this trip with a dog today." The shepherd gave a soft huff, like it almost understood. After nearly an hour of trudging through the trees, they reached the edge of town. The familiar sight of parked cars, wooden fences and houses felt surreal after the chaos of the river. Ethan sighed in relief. He was home, but just as he reached for his phone, now finally getting signal, the shepherd stopped. Ethan turned confused. The dog had frozen ears, stiff staring, straight ahead following its gaze. Ethan stomach dropped there just off the trail. Half hidden beneath some bushes was a torn collar, and next to it a leash. Ethan's fingers clenched. The fabric was frayed, almost ripped apart, like someone had tried to restrain the dog, and it had fought to get free. A cold chill ran down his spine. "What happened to you, Ethan?" murmured. Kneeling beside the leash, the dog hesitated, but after a moment it stepped forward, pressing its nose against the torn fabric. Ethan's heart pounded. This wasn't just a lost pet. Something had happened to this dog, but what his mind raced. Had it run away from someone? Had it been abandoned? Or, worse, had someone heard it? Ethan's jaw tightened. He looked down at the shepherd, who was still standing by the leash, tail low but eyes steady. This dog had saved his life, and now Ethan was determined to return the favor, no matter what it took. Ethan stared at the torn leash, his fingers brushing. Over the frayed edges, the fabric was damp mud, stained, and looked like it had been here for days. This wasn't an accident. He glanced at the German shepherd, who was still watching the leash with quiet intensity. The dog's tail hung low, its ears twitching at every distant sound. Ethan's mind raced. Had someone abandoned this dog, or had it broken free from something? Or someone far worse? The thought made his stomach tighten. "You didn't just get lost, did you?" Ethan murmured. The shepherd didn't move, but the silence between them spoke volumes. Taking a slow breath, Ethan picked up the leash, folding it carefully before shoving it into his jacket pocket. He wasn't sure why. Maybe instinct, maybe curiosity, maybe something deeper. One thing was clear: this dog had been through something, and Ethan wasn't about to ignore that. Ethan started toward home, his body still aching from the river's brutal grip. The shepherd followed without hesitation, staying close by his side like a silent shadow. As they reached the edge of town, Ethan noticed people watching. A few neighbors stood near their porches, whispering to each other, eyes flicking toward the drenched shepherd at his side. Ethan frowned. Did they recognize the dog? Before he could ask, an older man, Mr. Howard, a retired fisherman who knew everything about everyone in town, stepped forward. "That dog," Mr. Howard said, his voice low, but firm. "Where'd you find it?" Ethan hesitated. "By the river. It was trapped on a rock, almost drowned." Mr. Howard's expression darkened. His gaze drifted to the shepherd, who stared back in silence. "That dog's bad news, son," he muttered. "If I were you, I'd stay away." Ethan's jaw tightened. "What are you talking about? People say it belonged to someone out in the woods, a man who didn't take too kindly to strangers poking around his property. That dog showed up here once before looking half dead." And then Mr. Howard exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Next thing we know, that man came looking for it, and he wasn't happy." A cold chill ran down Ethan's spine. "Who was he?" Ethan asked. Mr. Howard hesitated, then shook his head again. "Just watch your back, kid, with that." The old man turned and walked away. Ethan stood, frozen, his pulse hammering. His gaze drifted down to the shepherd. The dog had saved his life, and now he was supposed to turn his back on it. "Hell no!" Ethan squared his shoulders and continued walking. He didn't care what rumors surrounded this dog. What mattered was the look in its eyes, a look that wasn't dangerous, but trusting, hopeful. The shepherd had chosen him, and Ethan wasn't going to let it down. But deep inside, he couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had owned this dog before might not be done looking for it. And that scared him more than anything. Ethan sat on the floor of his small living room, a towel draped over his shoulders, his damp clothes finally starting to dry. He had wrapped the German shepherd in another towel, rubbing its fur gently to warm it up. The dog didn't resist, if anything. It leaned into his touch, closing its eyes for a moment, as if finally allowing itself to rest. "You must be exhausted, huh?" Ethan murmured. The shepherd lifted its head slightly, then rested its chin on Ethan's knee. The weight of it, solid, trusting, made something tighten in Ethan's chest. How had he gone from a normal morning run to risking his life for a dog that had no home? And more importantly, what was he supposed to do? Now Ethan had always loved dogs, but he had never owned one. His apartment was small, and between his college classes and part-time job, he barely had time for himself, let alone a pet. But looking down at the shepherd, seeing the way it had chosen to stay by his side, despite everything, how could he turn it away? As if sensing his thoughts, the dog let out a soft sigh. Closing its eyes again, Ethan ran a hand over its fur, noticing the way its ribs showed faintly. Beneath the damp coat, it was too thin. How long had it been alone? And more importantly, what was it running from? That thought brought back Mr. Howard's warning. That dog's bad news. Son, if I were you, I'd stay away. Ethan frowned. Someone had owned this dog before someone who had come looking for it. Before was that person still out there? A sudden chill ran down his spine. Ethan glanced at the torn leash on the table. He hadn't paid much attention before, but now he noticed something else, a faint stain on the fabric. Was that blood? His pulse quickened. Had the dog fought to escape from whoever had it? Was it hurt? Ethan gently lifted one of the shepherd's paws, checking for cuts. The pads were rough, cracked in some places, as if it had been running for a long time. His jaw clenched. Someone had hurt this dog, and if Mr. Howard was right, that person might still be looking for it. A loud thud outside made Ethan's heart jump. The shepherd's head, snapped up ears. Suddenly stiff body tense, Ethan held his breath, listening. Another thud closer this time. Footsteps. Ethan slowly stood up, his muscles still sore from the river. He moved toward the window, careful not to make a sound. The shepherd followed, its eyes locked on the door, a low growl building in its throat. Ethan swallowed hard. Someone was outside. His fingers tightened into fists. Maybe it was just a neighbor. Maybe someone had seen him bring the dog home and wanted to ask about it. But deep down, he knew better. The shepherd growled again, louder this time. Ethan reached for his phone, his hand slightly shaking. The signal was back. He hovered his thumb over the emergency dial just in case. Then a knock. Not a polite, hesitant knock, a slow, deliberate knock. Ethan's stomach turned. Who the hell was at his door at this hour? His eyes flicked to the shepherd. The dog's fur bristled, its muscles tensed as if ready to pounce. Ethan took a slow breath, steadying himself, and then he reached for the door handle. Ethan's fingers hovered over the door handle, his breath shallow. The knocking had stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. It was thick, suffocating, waiting. The German shepherd stood rigid beside him, ears pricked forward, its entire body coiled like a spring. A low growl rumbled deep in its chest. Ethan swallowed hard. Every instinct screamed at him to be careful. Taking a slow breath, he cracked the door open just enough to see a man stood outside, tall, broad shoulders, a worn baseball cap shadowing his face. His jacket was stained with mud, his boots caked with dirt, and his eyes cold, hard, calculating, locked onto Ethan's. Immediately, "I think you've got something of mine," the man said. Ethan's grip tightened on the door. The shepherd's growl deepened. "Sorry," Ethan said, forcing his voice to stay. Even the man tilted his head slightly as if sizing him up. Then his gaze shifted to the dog. The shepherd stiffened. "There you are," the man muttered. He took a step forward. "Come on, boy, let's go." Ethan's stomach turned. The dog didn't move, didn't wag. Its tail didn't recognize this man as its owner. If anything, it pressed closer to Ethan's side. The man's eyes darkened. "Been looking for him," he said, his voice tightening. "Damn, Mutt ran off a few days ago, probably got spooked." But he's mine. Ethan's mind raced. Spooked? No, this dog didn't just run it. Escaped. Ethan's fingers brushed the torn leash in his pocket. The frayed fabric, the faint stain of blood. He thought about the way the dog had fought to survive, how it had risked its life to save him. And then he knew this wasn't a lost pet. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This dog had been abused, and now its abuser wanted it back. Ethan squared his shoulders. "He's not going anywhere," he said, voice firm. The man's expression shifted, first surprise, then annoyance, then anger. "You don't understand, kid," he muttered. "That's my dog and I want him back," the shepherd let out a snarl. Stepping in front of Ethan, its teeth flashed its fur, bristling. It wasn't afraid anymore. Neither was Ethan. "If he's yours, why is he terrified of you?" Ethan shot back. The man took another step forward. "Ethan didn't move, you better. Watch yourself, boy," the man hissed. "You have no idea what you're getting into." Ethan's heart pounded, but he didn't back down. "You should go," Ethan said, voice steady, "because if you take one more step, I'm calling the cops." The man's jaw clenched for a long moment. They just stared at each other. Then he took a slow step back. "Fine," he muttered. "Keep the damn mutt," but the way he said it sent a chill through Ethan's spine. This wasn't over. Without another word, the man turned and walked back into the dark. Ethan didn't move until he heard the distant crunch of gravel, a truck door slamming an engine, starting tires rolling away. Only then did he let out the breath he had been holding. The shepherd stayed tense, staring at the empty road, ears, twitching muscles, still on edge. Ethan knelt down beside it, placing a gentle hand on its back. "He's gone," he murmured. "You're safe now." The dog turned to him. Their eyes met, and in that moment Ethan knew they had saved each other. He exhaled, rubbing a hand through his damp hair. "Guess I need to figure out what to call you, huh?" The shepherd tilted its head slightly, its tail giving the faintest wag. Ethan thought for a second, then smiled. "How about River?" The shepherd blinked, then a full wag of the tail. Ethan chuckled. "Ruffling its fur, all right, River. It is." For the first time all day, the weight in his chest lifted. He had no idea what the future held. But one thing was certain, River wasn't alone anymore, and neither was he. This story is a reminder that sometimes we don't choose the ones we save, they choose us. If this touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe, like this video, and share it with someone who loves incredible stories like this one.